Welcome to this World Affairs Councils of America special program on the Russian invasion and war in Ukraine. We're delighted to present two distinguished experts on this topic, Ambassador Roman Popadiuk, former chairman of the World Affairs Councils of America, and Dr. Jim Coyle, who is a professor at visiting professor at Pepperdine University. I'll give a little more background into their bios. First, I want to welcome you. We have more than 350, in fact, close to 400 registrants from all around the country, from our 90 World Affairs Councils affiliates, and we are grateful for your attention this hour. 50 questions have already come in to this program. And so I will say, if we took each and every one of them, we would already not be able to spend more than a minute or so on each. So fortunately, there's some overlap. But for those of you during the conversation that want to try and get your question in, I encourage you to use the chat function or the Q&A box on this webinar, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. I'm Bill Clifford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, and we bring you this from Washington, D.C., and welcome you not only the American public, but also those viewers from around the world, and we have some. So without further ado, I am grateful to Roman Popadiuk for his leadership of WACA as chair during 2015 to 2020. He is currently the president of the U.S. Diplomacy Foundation, which oversees the development of the National Museum of American Diplomacy. Roman was a career Foreign Service officer, and he served as the first U.S. ambassador to Ukraine under George W. Bush. And Roman, thank you for your service, and thanks for coming back to WACA for this. Dr. James Coyle is, as I mentioned, an adjunct faculty at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He has for 25 years held a number of positions in the federal government, including Director of the Middle East Studies at the U.S. Army War College, First Secretary for Political Military Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, Turkey, and Senior Political Analyst for Palestinian Affairs. Dr. Coyle has been a past chairman of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, and his most recent book is Russia's Border Wars and Frozen Conflicts, where he argues that the Kremlin believes that border countries are slipping into the Western orbit. It creates frozen conflicts that encourage intervention by the Russian government. So with that, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I want to go straight to you, Jim, with a question from Carol Grimes of Jacksonville, Florida, at our council there. What does Putin want to accomplish with its war in Ukraine?
Well, there's a macro and a micro answer to that. The macro answer is that Putin wants to redesign the post-Cold War boundaries of Europe to make it more more favorable to Russia. The micro answer is that he's got a number of war aims that he has established. The first one is the removal of Zelensky and the current government of Ukraine. The second one is the recognition that Crimea is a part of Russia now and that the Donbass are independent republics. The third is a permanent pledge of neutrality from Ukraine. And the fourth and final one is that he wants a land bridge between the Donbass and the Crimea.
Do you see this in the context of previous Russian efforts to dominate the territory of Ukraine? Go back in history to decades, centuries.
Well, it's more than Ukraine. It's all of Eastern Europe. In 1990, the 14th Army in Moldova fought the central government and established the breakaway Republic of Transnistria. And of course, the West did nothing. In 1992, it invaded Georgia, fighting first against the Georgian government and then secondly for the Georgian government. And the West did nothing. In 2000, again, 1992, 1994, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Russians fought on both sides in that war, and the West did nothing. 2008, back to Georgia. Again, we did nothing. 2014, Ukraine, And again, we did nothing. So it's a pattern. It's a pattern, and it's a pattern that we allowed to be created, and now we're paying the price.
Bill,
Roman?
let me chime in here. I think it gets a little bit more complicated than that. I just want to expound on some of the stuff that Jim mentioned. I think the relationship between Russia and Ukraine historically is the key to actually the actions that Putin is undertaking currently in Ukraine. As our audience well knows, the Russians have, under the Tsars as well as under the Soviet Union, had control of much of the Ukrainian territory. And during those centuries of control, there was a lot of oppression of the Ukrainian culture and, as well as the peoples. In the 19th century, in two occasions, the Ukrainian language, for example, was outlawed. And of course, during the Stalinist period in the 1930s, it was the artificial famine under which millions of Ukrainians died. And if you go to Putin's article, famous article of last July, where he stated that Ukraine was never a country, is not a country, and that the Ukrainian people are not separate from the Russian people. There's an attitude among many of the Russian leaders, as well as among many in the intellectual circles and in the general society, that there's some kind of special affinity between the two peoples, and the Russians have a right to be involved there and to control that territory and to control that destiny. And you can see that throughout history, because the eastern parts that Jim referred to in Ukraine, for example, have been historically referred to by the Russians as Novorossiya. So I would say in terms of goals that Putin has is, number one, to try to restore that affinity from his perspective, to gain control of Ukraine. And a tangent to that is the concern that Ukraine was moving toward the West, irrespective of NATO and EU. A Ukraine that's moving toward the West, that culturally and historically was seen as Russian, is something that the Russia would not allow. And secondly, along those lines, Bill, I would say that not only Ukraine moving toward the West, but Ukraine becoming a democratic society. This was something that the Russian government could not countenance, because this would be an example to the Russian people. Remember, Russia is an authoritarian state. It has a strong authoritarian tradition throughout its centuries of Tsars and Soviet rule, now currently under Putin. And for Ukraine to move toward the West as a democratic society would undermine a lot of the, let's say, the narrative that the Russian government has about its own role and its own peoples. So that was it. But beyond that, I think there are two other issues here that are very much at stake. And Jim, feel free to chime in. I think Russia, along with China, is basically challenging what we've already been discussing in academic circles, as well as among talking heads on TV, is the liberal international order,
yes,
where there's the rule of law, human rights, respect for human rights, respect for the individual, and free market economies. Both Russia and China stand against all four of those. They believe in the state being over the individual. In other words, the individual subservient to the state. They're against the human rights the way we espouse it. They're against democracy as we espouse it. And of course, they're against the rule of law that doesn't favor their perspectives. So they're geared toward that. And along that, Russia has this kind of view that it is the representative of the true goals of that part of the world. It regards Western Europe as decadent, and that Russia is the one that needs to save the area. And so they have this idea of trying to push the United States out of Europe, and as well as to kind of, to break up the NATO alliance, as well as the European cohesion. So there are many goals in that, but I think much of it stems from the Ukrainian-Russian relationship historically that I tried to outline.
Bill, I hope you don't want a lot of controversy here, because Roman and I agree on all of this.
Well, we should get some disagreement maybe from the questioners. We'll see. Jim, I'm going to turn to you in one moment, but Roman, I'd like you to amplify something for us, if you would. And that is, you served in Kyiv and established our first embassy there shortly after Ukraine became independent in December 1991. And at that time, it suddenly was the second largest country in Europe, and also possessed the third largest nuclear stockpile, which it returned ultimately to Russia, the Russian Federation. So talk about the time and also the quality of Ukrainian people's sense of being a nation and what that independence meant?
Yeah, that's a very good and fair question. I spent a lot of time traveling around the country, Bill, and there was a sense of nationalism, quite frankly, throughout much of the country. And I would just point to a number of things here, because at that time there was a lot of discussion among circles and in the public domain, obviously, that there would be conflict between the Ukrainians and the ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, particularly in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. And I would point to the fact that in December of 1991, when Ukraine had its independence referendum, so to speak, had a referendum on independence on December 1, and over 90% of Ukrainians voted in favor of it. And this included the majority of ethnic Russians, both in the eastern Ukraine as well as in Crimea. And Crimea is the only area in Ukraine that had a majority, that has an ethnic majority of Russians, okay? It's the only one area in Ukraine that has that majority. Even they voted for independence. And the rationale behind that, Bill, was that everyone believed that there was a better chance for success and growth for themselves and their families and their children in an independent Ukraine than under the Russian rule. So Ukraine, has had its issues domestically, but it was always able to solve those issues, even in Crimea, where there was a majority ethnic Russian, where there was a majority ethnic Russians. I said it wasn't until the little green men showed up in this century that it really became a problem for them. So I would say there was a sense of the people were bound by a common destiny of looking to the future, that Ukraine offered great hopes and possibilities for them and their families. Ukraine was also bound by its cultural history. While people speak Russian, they also speak Ukrainian. A lot of them do obviously speak Ukrainian. And there was a great sense of renaissance in their culture at the time of independence. And there was a big push to use the Ukrainian language. As I mentioned previously, the Ukrainian language at times had been outlawed under the Tsarist Empire. And so there was a revival. So yes, I would say I saw the rise of a sense of nationhood that encompassed all people's ethnic groups on the territory, because Ukrainians identified Ukrainian as being geographic based. If you lived in Ukraine, you were Ukrainian. And a sense of cultural renaissance and pride in that culture and in that language.
Jim, you mentioned, thank you, Roman. You mentioned, Jim, that one of Putin's motivations is that he contends that NATO expansion provoked this and needed to be defended against. And in fact, at a NATO summit in 2008, in April, he told President Bush, Ukraine is not even a nation state. There are many other aspects of his recent speeches that reflect the same. Talk about how that relates to key agreements and efforts by the West over time, starting with, say, and one viewer from Pennsylvania is wanting clarification on what the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances were back in 1994 regarding territory and so forth.
He went even further in 2008, and he does echo what he has said in more recent speeches. He told President Bush that not only was it an artificial creation, but if the United States persisted in offering them membership into NATO, that he would make sure that Ukraine ceased to exist. So that was a warning he gave us in 2008. So what is the Budapest Memorandum? You mentioned already that Ukraine overnight became the third largest nuclear power in the world because so many of the Soviet missiles were on Ukrainian territory. Interestingly, even though they had the missiles, they never had the launch codes. They stayed in Moscow. But after vigorous negotiations, we managed to convince the Ukrainians to give up the nuclear weapons, to turn them over to Moscow for destruction, in return for which we signed the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom guaranteed the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. There's been a number of other treaties in which Ukraine was, the Russians agreed to keep the Ukraine intact. The most famous one, I would say, was the memorandum. But there was also in 2008, there was a friendship treaty signed between the two countries, in which both sides pledged to respect the territorial integrity and the borders of each other's states. Now, Putin allowed that treaty to expire after 10 years, but it was still in effect in 2014 when he seized the Crimea and his underlings seized the Donbass.
I want to thank Peter Sheridan of Greater Reading Council for that question on the Budapest Agreement.
Bill, could I just add one quick
Sure.
on that? Jim, not to quibble too much, but I think we have to be careful because the Budapest Memorandum didn't guarantee, it just offered assurances. And that was, I know it's a fine line, it's a distinction though, because a guarantee would have mandated us to do something where an assurance gives a lot of wiggle, for lack of a better term, wiggle room. And that's been the overriding argument that's been the big argument over time on, how commitment, what kind of commitment does the memorandum actually commit the countries that signed it?
No, that's right. In 2014, when Russia seized Crimea, people turned to the Bucharest Memorandum to say, the West, you have to do something. And their answer was, no, now wait a minute, that's not really a treaty. That was just a memorandum. That was just what we said we'd like to see happen. So there was wiggle room.
There was a lot of wiggle room.
That's a good way to segue into some questions. Many of our viewers have questions. What could the West have done better? And of course, what should the West do now? In the sort of quarterbacking Monday style area of what could we have done to prevent where we are, Werner Salinger asks, after the fall of the USSR in 1991, what would you have, Jim, why don't you take on this? What would you
Thanks.
have argued are the US and allied posture should have been? And I'll come to you next, Roman.
That's okay.
So this was the period of unilateralism. This was the period where Charles Krauthammer was writing that we had no peer competitors. Not even ancient Rome in all its glory had the power and influence of the United States. And because of this, this triumphalism, we had won the Cold War. We ignored Russian concerns. And as early as 1992, even Boris Yeltsin was claiming that that the former Soviet Union was a sphere of influence that was Russia's, and we were to keep out of it, and we should let Russia handle its own affairs in that area. And of course, and the other thing that happened was we made promises, and Roman, you can quibble with me on this, but we made promises about the fact that we weren't going to let NATO expand militarily further into the East. We sent James Baker, Secretary of State, to the Kremlin, where he said we would not move 1 inch further eastward. And of course, in 1999, we started admitting countries of the Warsaw Pact into NATO. Each time this happened, each time that NATO's borders came 1,000 kilometers closer to Moscow, Moscow said this is a violation of our core vital national interests, and we ignored it. We should have been more sensitive, and we should have also remembered that NATO is a military alliance. Now, I'm going to get flack for what I'm going to say here, but you have to ask yourself, some of these countries that we admitted into NATO, at the time, we were letting them come in as a halfway house on their way to meeting the requirements of joining the European Union. What exactly did they give NATO as military power? How did they enhance the alliance? And I would contend they didn't. I would contend they became a drain on the alliance. But, okay,
Well,
Roman.
well, you're
Roman,
right. You're
hold
right,
up,
you're right,
Roman.
Jim. I will quibble with you.
Okay.
As far as I can recall, there was no understanding about not having NATO move eastward. I think, so we have to be careful about that. What I would say, Bill, in terms of the overarching question that you posed, I think we committed two fundamental errors at the beginning when the Soviet Union fell apart. I think the first one was that we kind of concentrate our efforts on Russia. There was a feel, and I'm simplifying this view here to get to the point. There was an overarching feeling that the emphasis on Russia was important for a variety of reasons. Most important is that we felt that not only as a nuclear power, we have to have close relations, obviously, with them, but as well as with any other country around the world. But the feeling was that if Russia could develop as a democracy and a free market economy, that would change their system, and therefore their view of their surrounding areas and the territories that they lost would become a little bit more complacent, so to speak. That they wouldn't regret the loss of the territories, that they would have a positive influence on those territories. The other side of the coin was that you can't expect Russia to develop overnight. That even when the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia maintained a huge empire. It's a huge landmass stretching numerous time zones. And as Jim mentioned himself, the Russians spoke about the near abroad already in the early 90s, about Russians that were living in the newly independent countries. And so the feeling was that you should support these countries, particularly a country like Ukraine, which was the biggest one and most important of the former republics, because if Russia didn't succeed in those twin goals of democracy and economic reform, then maybe you would have a buffer, and I don't want to use that in a negative term, but you would have Ukraine as a country that could survive and be viable on its own, and thereby preclude Russia from trying to expand the way it's trying to do right now. That was one fundamental philosophical error that I think we encountered. The other thing that we should have done a little bit better is started building Ukraine up irrespective of that decision. Well, I shouldn't say it was a single decision, irrespective of that view. We should have poured a lot more into Ukraine, particularly at the turn of the century when Russia started heating up in terms of its views for NATO, et cetera, et cetera. I think we dropped the ball in terms of supporting Ukraine militarily and financially during the last 2 decades. I know that we gave a lot of assistance, but we definitely could have done a lot more, particularly in the military area.
Thank you. With a view to transitioning to what's going on right now, I want to provide some statistics that I was tempted to provide at the top. And this has to do with the casualties that we're seeing from this unprovoked, horrific war that has galvanized almost all of global opinion against Moscow. The statistics are a little tough because they come from different sources, but we're looking at top line about 13,000 deaths so far in the conflict, and the lower estimates would be in the low thousands. So what I mean by this is, for civilians, the Ukrainian government would estimate over 2,300 so far killed in Mariupol only. The United Nations puts the whole figure at 691 killed. US numbers have 2,000 to 4,000 killed among Ukrainian armed forces, National Guard and volunteers, where they say that's 2,000 to 4,000. The Ukrainian government would say it's only 1,300. The US government estimates 3,500 to 6,000 Russian armed forces killed. The Russian government plays that down to less than 500. And in the Donetsk, the PR forces less, 45 to 75 killed so far. So top line, that would be about 13,000. And that is the number of total deaths in Ukraine since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. So we're already in a 3-week period matching what has been a conflict in eastern Ukraine going back 8 years. So looking at those numbers, Roman, today or overnight, Boris Johnson said the West should have done more after 2014. So we're again looking back, but what should allies and NATO do now?
That's a very good question. It's a very tough question. I think a number of things need to be undertaken. I think, first of all, we needed to take the narrative away from Putin. What do I mean by that? Putin seems to be setting the pace of actions, and we're in a reactive mode all the time. And this has kind of put us on the defensive. And that sends a very poor signal, not only to the outside world, but to Putin also, which kind of, I think, encourages him to take further actions. I mean, a classic example right now is the issue about the MiGs that we were talking about transferring to Ukraine, where Poland wanted to have the MiGs transferred to them via Ramstein Air Force Base, and then the United States backed off on that deal. And I'm sure you've seen the news reports and all that, so I don't want to get into that. So I think we need a more coherent policy emanating out of Washington in terms of what we're going to do, and not be beholden to being reactive all the time to Putin, because that puts him in control of the action. In terms of what we can do specifically to assist the Ukrainians, number one, speaking about the MiGs, I think we can provide those MiGs. I know there's a lot of argument that they will not be militarily helpful to Ukraine. I beg to differ. Any bit of assistance to Ukraine is helpful, but the morale booster of that would be just immense to the Ukrainian military and to the peoples themselves. And so that kind of equipment needs to be sent in. The other thing that we need to do is, I think, make greater use of the United Nations. I think the United Nations has been very absent in this, and I don't know if the United States has been making use of the United Nations. I know the Russians could veto actions through the Security Council, but a General Assembly resolution is something that possibly the world can operate under. And under that General Assembly resolution, what I would try to do is try to institute a system for no-fly zone for humanitarian purposes. I think the UN would have the ability to pass that kind of resolution, and under that rubric, as I mentioned, we can institute a no-fly zone. The second thing that could really take place is, we talk about no boots on the ground. Nobody wants an expanded conflict that pits the United States and Russia against each other. But I think that a call for international brigades would be very helpful. I mean, Vladimir Putin himself has said that he's calling upon Syrians to come into the conflict. Well, he's opened the door here where any volunteers can be sent in, and we can try to help and facilitate that kind of volunteer force to come into Ukraine. So in terms of military equipment, no-fly zones, getting the UN involved to give an umbrella for the actions, all these kinds of steps can be taken.
Jim, do you want to comment on that? I think
I do.
Secretary General Guterres has actually said, definitely slowed the roll on the concept of a no-fly zone. Secretary of State Blinken is not there yet. NATO is not there yet, although Estonia, a member country, has come out in favor of a no-fly zone. Okay.
Well, let me qualify. I mentioned no-fly zone. I would say a no-fly zone as a humanitarian corridor. Okay, I'm not sure, because I'm not talking about pitting the United States against Russia. I'm sorry to take Jim's time, but I just mentioned no-fly zone. I meant a humanitarian corridor for no-fly zone.
But you can't have a no-fly zone without taking on Russia. A no-fly zone, by definition, you start out by removing all the air defenses, and those air defenses are manned by Russians. And then if that no-fly zone is challenged by Russia, then you have American planes firing on Russian planes. Now, let me tell you why this is important. I do agree that we need to provide Ukraine with as much help as we possibly can. But there's an invisible line, and that invisible line is based on Russian national security strategy. specifically states in Russian national security strategy, and it's changed from what it was 10 years ago, that if Russian interests are challenged, Russia reserves the right to have first use of nuclear weapons. Now, the problem is, what does it mean to challenge Russian interests? There's only one person that can answer that, and that's Vladimir Putin. So we have this invisible line. Putin's willing to let us do some things. But at what point do we cross that invisible line and he says, oh, my interests are truly being challenged, and I'm going to resort to nuclear weapons? I do think what we need to do is we need to offer Putin somehow, something, what Sun Tzu refers to as the Golden Bridge, which is some sort of off-ramp that gives him the choice to say the benefits of ending this for me, for Vladimir Putin, exceeds the benefits I gained by keeping it going. And I'll be honest, I don't really know what it is, because Zelensky has already said he's now willing to make a pledge of permanent neutrality, and that has not stopped the war. I don't think it would be conscionable to meet the other demands, the war demands of giving up permanently the Crimea, the Donbass, the corridor. I don't think that would be right, but maybe something else. And I'll give you something else to consider. And I take this from Henry Kissinger when he was National Security Advisor. And that's the question of linkage. We're very focused on what's going on in the territory of Ukraine. But just as Vladimir Putin is looking at areas beyond Ukraine, maybe we should too. Japan still has claims to the Kuril Islands. Kaliningrad used to be known as Königsberg. There are populations in the Middle Volga that President Zelensky was supporting that are looking for more national self-expression. And over again, I mean, two can play at this game. We don't have to just sit back. Romans, I think, accurately said we have to take the dialogue, whatever you want to say, away from Putin. Don't let him set the standards. Let's us take the offensive.
What do you?
If you let me, I'm sorry. I'd like to follow up on what Jim said. I agree with many of the points that Jim mentioned. I don't think there's to use an old term that's been around now for a few years, off-ramp. I don't think the West can offer an off-ramp to Putin. As long as he feels he's winning, he's going to continue this war to the point where he controls the territory and the Ukrainian people. The only off-ramp that can be offered is if Putin gives himself an off-ramp. And the only way you can do that is in two ways. You got to make the cost-benefit analysis too high for him now. And yes, that means to give a lot of military equipment to Ukraine. And the other thing is, going along the last point that Jim made and that I have been discussing, is you have to, for lack of a better term, meet him head on with his bluffs. Because right now he controls the pace of actions. If we react to everything he does, we have to get one step ahead of him and have him react. And that's why this thing of a humanitarian no-fly zone, Jim, I think would be the start of something. We don't call it military. We have the General Assembly vote it, and now the ball's in his court. Because in that no-fly zone, we could even have, countries from Latin America or Asia or in Africa participate in it. So it's a world effort. And that puts a lot of pressure, not only on the Russians, but as well as the Chinese who will basically support them. And so I think that's the kind of jump we have to make in our strategy to get leapfrog Putin's, actions and confront him with one where now it's his turn to think and how's he going to react.
So, Jim, Roman says the way to directly confront Putin is through multilateralism, if I'm summarizing correctly, Roman. But we have a viewer, Joni Rice, who's asking for comment, and I pose this to you, Jim, which is, excuse me, because the questions keep coming so fast. Can you comment on the notion that Putin understands toughness vis-a-vis a fist rather than a more nuanced diplomatic means of approaching him, or the economic sanctions that are extremely severe?
Well, what she's asking is the question that has the US government tied up in knots right now, which is, how does Vladimir Putin think? What is his state of mind? I really can't comment on that. The second half, that last comment you just made though, Bill, what was that?
Well, basically showing the fist over a more
Right.
nuanced diplomatic approach. And of course, we have, I think, Jake Sullivan and his counterpart in China speaking in Italy now, but also the economic sanctions. So we've pursued diplomacy. We're pursuing a really some unprecedented sanctions, both in the US and Europe, but it appears not to be enough.
Well, the economic sanctions are working to some extent, but Roman and I were talking about this just before we started this. There's exceptions to the economic sanctions. We've taken Russian banks out of the SWIFT system, but not all banks. We have exempted the sale of oil and gas, which accounts for 43% of the Kremlin's budget every year. So there are holes in the sanctions. But I'll tell you one thing where I see a little bit of hope, and that is the Chinese. Putin has turned to the Chinese and said, I need military equipment. Can you send me military equipment? Now, China might ultimately give it to him. I don't know. I can't predict it. But the fact that they've hesitated, the fact that they're waiting to see what happens, that gives me hope that maybe, again, taking from Henry Kissinger, we could have a little bit of triangulation here and eventually use the Chinese against the Russians and use the Russians against the Chinese. Now, that doesn't help Ukraine, which is today's topic, but it could help the United States in the long term.
Roman, President Zelensky and his foreign minister have appealed to China. I think China has a reasonable amount of investments in Ukraine. We have a question from a viewer about what the US and partners can do with respect to bringing China away from Russia on our side of this.
No, just to pick up on what you mentioned, yes, China and Ukraine have a close economic relationship. For Ukraine, China is its largest trading partner now, and the Chinese have earmarked Ukraine as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which would be a venue through which the Chinese can tie their economic development plans and their economic outreach through Ukraine into the rest of Europe. So Ukraine is very pivotal for them in this Belt and Road Initiative that they've undertaken. I don't know how much we can impact the Chinese view of the situation right now, Bill. While there's a relationship between Russia and China, most famously shown by that agreement that they signed last month, where they committed to an enduring partnership between the two states. You have to remember that in international relations, each state is going to look out after its own interests, and the Chinese are no different than any other state. For the Chinese right now, they're in the driver's seat because Russia is experiencing extremely heavy losses, in comparison to what everyone expected in Ukraine, which means Russia's getting weaker, which means the leverage that the Chinese will have over Russia is that much greater. Could you imagine Putin trying to renegotiate an oil and gas deal with the Chinese now when he's been sanctioned and he's suffering militarily? The Chinese could set the price at any level they practically want. And Chinese are very famous for negotiating very low prices, and they'll use any leverage they can. At the same time, this has stoked a lot of concerns in Asia about security, which has done two things. Number one, obviously the Asian countries are concerned about what China's role will be in view of all this, particularly as regards to Taiwan. At the same time, there's a sense of urgency to raise their defense budgets and to get closer to the United States in terms of defense aspects. So the Chinese are kind of in between the Western world and the Eastern world, so to speak, and they see themselves as basically being the driver's seat. I think you're going to see the Chinese kind of going along with Jim mentioned, give the Russians a few things just to keep the communication going between two sides. But I don't think they want to get into a position where they're going to become part and parcel of the conflict. Look, the things are going badly for the Russians, irrespective of how it turns out from the Chinese perspective. They don't want to be part of the war as such, which would then incur sanctions on them. And so they don't want to be get involved to that extent. So I think the Chinese are going to try to have, to use an old cliche, have the cake and eat it too. So right now, I don't think we can really influence the Chinese to do anything, because right now they feel themselves as going in a position where Russia, they have the upper hand, and so there's no need for them to tip the scale one way or the other at this time.
Following up on Roman's comment, we've seen this happen before. In 2014, there was a pipeline, the Power of Siberia pipeline. It had been built, and for 10 years, China and Russia were negotiating over price, and that pipeline sat there empty. Once we got involved, or not us, but once the Russians invaded Ukraine and sanctions started to be thrown on, overnight, Russia agreed to China's price. And now getting ready for this time, a month before this invasion, Russia agreed to China's price on the second pipeline. There were two pipelines involved. So we've seen this happening, yeah.
Jim, I want to ask you a question from a couple colleagues. Tim Geisler in Montana wants your thoughts on the possibility of a nuclear event, and that could also include the attacks we've seen on nuclear facilities. And Patrick Ryan, our head in the Tennessee World Affairs Council, asks if you consider that threat as tactical strikes in Ukraine or beyond.
Well, first of all, the power plant, I do think that was an accident. It was probably a local commander. Troops got fired upon from the power plant, and so they responded without thinking that, oh my heavens, this is a nuclear plant. And I think that Russia's paying a little bit more attention to that than they were before. As for whether or not they would use nukes, as I said, it is in their national security strategy that they would use nukes. Now, there are a number of Westerners have written that they would follow an escalate to de-escalate strategy, yes, which the bluff, as Roman was mentioning, that they would maybe drop a tactical nuke on Ukraine in that to show the West, hey, we're serious about this. We're willing to cross the nuclear threshold, back down. And the expectation then is that the United States would back down, that the West would back down. I don't know. Would the United States back down? I don't know. We have stated over and over, Ukraine's not NATO, and therefore we don't have to respond the way it would in Article 5. But if you read the national security strategy, they do not argue escalate to de-escalate. That's something that we've come up with. They argue that you can use nuclear weapons to win on the battlefield.
Roman?
I can't argue with the outline that Jim presented, but I don't think the Russians would be willing to undertake that kind of a drastic step. There'd be ramifications not only for the Ukrainians, obviously, who would be hit with that, but also depending on the size of the bomb and where it's dropped, could have ramifications on Russian society as well as on Russian troops in the area. So that's a dangerous line for them to cross. The second thing is, I don't think anyone in the Russian ruling circles would think that this is a threat against their society to the extent that they have to drop a nuclear bomb. I still think that they would still view this as a conventional mission and in terms of forces, and that they would continue along those lines. The third thing I would say is, going back to the China point, I think this is where China would get involved. I don't, if there was an attempt to do this or a desire to do this, I would assume, and here I'm, I can't assume anything, but I'll just assume, that this would be something that the Chinese would be given a heads up on. And I think that China would not favor something along, because this really opens the door and identifies them with a regime that has really gone rogue in terms of how it conducts war and how it reacts to the international community. And while the Chinese are not favorable toward the liberal international order, they still want to play a role in it and shape it to their view. And something like this would really put them on their back feet and put both them and Russians in a corner that it would be very difficult for them to get out of over the next few years if anything like this should happen. So I think there'll be a confluence of forces, external with China, internal among the Russian ruling groups, as well as battlefield conditions that would probably, I think, would preclude them from actually engaging in this kind of warfare.
And following up on Roman's point, they don't need to use nukes at this point. We are looking at CNN and we're watching the valiant Ukrainian troops beating back the Russians, blowing up Russian tanks, et cetera, et cetera. You could argue that on TikTok, Russia is losing this war. But if you look at what's going on the ground, Russia may not be winning as fast as they thought they would. They didn't capture Kiev in a lightning strike in the first couple of days, but every morning that we wake up, Russia now controls more territory than it did the day before, as it just destroys cities using the Russian way of war. And as long as they're winning like this, they don't need to look to more grievous ways of waging this war.
Okay, let me just add one more thing here, Bill. This goes to the battlefield conditions. You have to realize Ukraine is a large territory, 40 million people. To use tactical nuclear weapons would be not conducive to the type of for the Russian, would not be helpful for the Russians, because you're looking eventually at a guerrilla warfare type of stuff. And how do tactical nuclear weapons, I'm not a military guy, so I could be corrected here. Tactical nuclear weapons will serve a purpose if you're hitting a key objective to destroy an enemy or the willpower of an enemy, or to destroy a military unit, et cetera, et cetera. In a guerrilla warfare, we have 40 million people stretched over the size of an area almost like the size of Texas. Does not make military sense. It would not reach your military objective, quite frankly, but will lead to all the negative connotations and outcomes that I mentioned earlier. So I think from a military perspective, it just doesn't make sense to even consider this kind of thing. I mean, I'll defer to anyone that's had the military background on this, but it just doesn't make sense from my perspective to engage in tactical nuclear warfare in a situation like this. Now, all this is hypothetical, and I hope it continues to be hypothetical.
True.
Jim, I think Jim and I share the same perspective. This is a conventional war. The Russians are winning it, and it will eventually become a guerrilla warfare if this continues, unless the conflict ends before then. And in that environment, I just can't see a tactical nuclear use being comprehensible or useful, quite frankly.
I want to get this question in because it's also happens to be from Jim Coyle in Reston, Virginia, for Jim Coyle. Since you mentioned the civilian population being besieged and that line, when is the line crossed on a humanitarian sense that would prompt engagement from NATO in this war, or the US and NATO in this war?
I think you have to look first to the UN. They're the ones that would be more interested in humanitarian issues. If the UN decides, and Roman already mentioned, it would have to be the General Assembly, because Russia would veto anything under Article 4, Article 5 in the Security Council. But if they were to decide that we need to do something about the humanitarian problem, then I think that we would react. I also think if the EU responded, because the EU is the one that's absorbing close to 3 million refugees at this point. And if they decide that this is destabilizing Europe, then again, we would have to do something. But just as a part of the battle, I hate to say this, but I think it would just be considered collateral damage.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the nearly 3 million refugees, and they are streaming into several countries, including tiny, really poor Moldova. And one of your colleagues from Irvine, California, Ergun Kirlikovali, is asking, will Russia continue its conquest to include Moldova? And other viewers have asked, what will happen if this conflict goes beyond the borders of Ukraine?
Who are you asking?
That is Ergun. I'm asking you first, Jim.
Okay.
And then Roman can comment if he likes.
I think that first Russia has to win the battle in Ukraine. And as Roman just mentioned, I think this will degenerate eventually into a partisan guerrilla warfare, because Russia does not have the troops in order to actually militarily control all of Ukraine. It's just not possible. If Russia does manage to somehow subdue Ukraine, and the United States and NATO lets them get away with it, I don't think Moldova would be the target, because Moldova is part of NATO. But then I think the next target would be Georgia, who has been given the same promise of someday joining NATO, who has the same 10% of its territory controlled by groups that are backed by Moscow, and because they are not yet NATO, we have the same issue with Georgia as we do with Ukraine, that the West could say, well, we really can't do too much here.
What do you think about that, Roman?
Yeah,
Uldis Sipples in Boston asks if NATO would defend all its member countries from further aggression by Russia. And Jim makes a good point about Georgia, not yet a NATO member.
Yeah, but I don't think Moldova is a NATO member either, unless I'm wrong here. If someone can check that while I go through the other thing. I'd like to pick up on your issue of the humanitarian assistance and all first, before we get into the other question. Just to follow, we all talk about the number of refugees that have resulted as due to the conflict in Ukraine. Approximately over 2.5 million now, I think, that have fled into parts of Europe. But people have to remember that this is compounded by the fact that after the 2014 Russian invasions and takeover of Crimea, that Ukraine generated something like 4 million refugees and displaced people internally. So they already had a massive humanitarian crisis. So the time to intervene for humanitarian reasons, I say, is right now. We can't wait a day longer. The refugees since 2014, as I mentioned, have been compounded with the ones that are taking place, that are being created now. So it's important for the international community to get involved right now. And in terms of what the next steps would be if the Russians take control of Ukraine, I can see them pushing against the West a little bit more. Now, I don't know what your research has shown, Bill.
On Moldova?
Yeah.
Neutral.
Yeah. So
yeah.
It's not a, so, and you have to remember that Moldova, after independence, had a Russian presence, because the Transnistria area of Moldova kind of separated from Moldova. It's part of Moldova, but the Russians have a troop station there since Moldova's independence. So the next logical area for the Russians to move, and very easily to move after Ukraine, would be Moldova, I would think, because it's not aligned with anyone, and at the same time, it's fairly weak in terms of military, and there's already a Russian troop presence there. So I could see the Russians not stopping with Ukraine. But I'm ever optimistic, Bill. I think the Ukrainians will stop them and get them bogged down. The Ukrainians have a strong and resilient spirit. They've shown it throughout the centuries, and you can sure enough see it now the way they're fighting.
I didn't mean to imply that Moldova is a member of NATO and has NATO guarantees. I just think Georgia is a more important target. Moldova can't be part of NATO, just as Georgia and Ukraine can't be part of NATO, because NATO insists that you have full control of your territory before you can be a member. And Transnistria, as you mentioned, is under Russian control and has been.
A final question to each of you, one for each country. Roman, Deborah Schultz from the World Affairs Council of Cincinnati in Northern Kentucky points out that the courageous Volodymyr Zelensky vows to keep fighting, but who takes over if he dies? He's actually going to address Congress tomorrow. But if he were to be killed, who will rebuild Ukraine? Who will motivate and feed and support the Ukrainian people?
That's a very good question, but I'm going on the assumption that Zelensky is going to survive this, and the Ukrainians will be able to persevere one form or another. As I mentioned earlier, I think in a very positive light. The Ukrainians are very resilient. They're very committed to their own independence and their own and shaping their own future, and they'll push on. And the worst case scenarios, as has proven, there's always a leader that comes forth to lead the cause. When you look back at Zelensky, his popularity had been going downhill after his election. He was a comedian by trade and an actor by trade, and no one expected this kind of leadership from him. And he sure enough has risen to the occasion. So I see him as leading this fight forward. He's a great inspiration, not only to the Ukrainian people, but to the international community. So I have to look to the future and I think positively that Zelensky is going to see this battle through and lead the Ukrainian people to success. Success meaning that they'll be able to survive and stave off the Russians in the long term.
Jim, Rachel McCool in Pittsburgh asks, what is the way out for Putin? What would keep him in power? Does he have a future as a leader in the international community after this? And what would be the broader consequences for world order?
If Putin survives this, I think long term, not short term, not even medium term, I think long term, he could still be a major figure on the national stage, because whoever is the leader of Russia still controls 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads, and we can't forget that. But I do think that this war has weakened Putin incredibly. I would not be surprised if we didn't see Putin going the way of Nikita Khrushchev after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I wouldn't be, even if he manages to conquer Ukraine, as we said, he won't be able to hold on to it. There'll be partisan warfare. There are thousands of Russian soldiers going home in body bags, and I think that his days are numbered.
Bill, do you mind if I wrap this up a little?
You got 10 seconds, Roman.
10 seconds.
I have to outro here.
No. I think the only way for Putin to survive all this and to put an end to all this is to give himself an off-ramp. And what do I mean by that? He declares victory and goes home. And by declaring victory, he holds on to the eastern parts of Ukraine, which give him a land bridge to Crimea. And also he can claim that the historic lands of Russian control have been liberated and are now back under Russia. Remember, that part of Ukraine was known as Novo, and still is known to Russian circles as Novorossiya, New Russia. So I think that if he can claim victory in that respect and have the old Novorossiya taken over, this would give him a greater frozen conflict area in Ukraine, which would give pressure against Ukraine and its own internal politics into the futures. That's the only off-ramp, and then he's got to decide at what point he wants to take that off-ramp.
And my final comment is Slava Ukraini.
Very
Slava
good.
Heroyam.
To all of you, thank you for this engaging conversation, and especially to you, Roman and Jim, for your insight and for your leadership to World Affairs Councils.
Thank you, Bill. Enjoyed it. Jim, nice seeing you.
You too, Roman.
Okay, take care.
Thanks,
guys.
everybody. Have
Okay,
a good
take care.
afternoon, and
Thanks.
let's keep an eye on Ukraine. Thank you.
Bye, Bill.
Take care.